Thank you very much. I'm David Gordon. I'm a professor in the School for Policy Studies at the University of Bristol, and I have done research with the World Health Organization and UNICEF on safe water and safe water management. And I have been working for a long time with Frank Water in various capacities, including jointly supervising PhD students. So welcome to day 3, this session of the GW4 Water Security Alliance Conference. This session is on innovating to aid integrated water resources management, the role of research and technological management. Water resources management is, of course, one of the most important SDGs. It's just Sustainable Development Goal 6.5, and it's a key area where research and practice, what we used to call in the good old days, praxis, can combine in order to improve the way people live and the health and welfare of people around the world. We have 3 excellent speakers for you this morning, and the way the format's going to work is I'm going to ask them all to talk briefly for 5 minutes, have some Q&As based on what they're saying, and then open it up to general questions. Hopefully we'll get a discussion going. Please raise your hand and then unmute your mic when you want to speak. Okay, so our first speaker is Jon Shepherd. He's head of programs and funding at Frank Water. Frank is a Bristol-based NGO that focuses on water management, mainly in India and Nepal. Jon has over 15 years experience of working in development and humanitarian projects, and he was previously the Indian program manager at Frank Water, and before that he worked for Oxfam New Zealand in the Pacific and Oxfam UK and Africa and Asian countries. He has recently led research with the engineering consultancy Arup, and over the last 3 years looking at how integrated water resources management can be used by local governments and NGOs, and how integrated water resources management expertise can be utilised particularly through apps. Jon is currently part of a NERC funded research team with the University of West of England, focusing on the application of remote bacteria sensors in locally managed water supply system. Jon.
Hi guys, good morning everybody, and thank you for chairing this morning, Dave, and thank you for that introduction. So I'm just going to give you guys just 5 minutes of sort of description of why, in a way, this workshop came together and what I've been working on over the last 3 years with Arup, the engineering company, and what potentially we're hoping to get out of this next hour. So as Dave said, basically I've been working with Frank Water, which is the water and sanitation NGO. We've been looking at water management in India and Nepal for over a decade actually, and I've been with Frank Water for about 5 or 6 years, really focusing on moving beyond just looking at water sanitation and hygiene and starting to look at water management, the building of water security planning, and then really coming into systems thinking, being inspired by people like IRC WASH in the Netherlands, and specifically looking at how systems thinking can be applied to SDG 6.5 on integrated water resource management, and also looking at the practical elements of how IWRM is done by NGO workers and local government extension workers, rather than a lot of the work that's happened on IWRM is very much at a kind of country level. I think if you look at SDG 6.5 and the way that it's monitored, that is done at a country level. It's done every 3 years through a voluntary self-assessment. And there are a lot of issues with that if you try and translate that to the district level where most work actually happens, and that's where my that's where my area is. So just to be clear at the beginning of this, I think most of the people on this call are people who are doctors and PhDs, students and professors, etc., etc. I am not one of those. I'm what you might call an NGO WASH practitioner. So I'm very much in the sort of nuts and bolts of how you actually get WASH services to people in remote areas of South Asia. And as Dave said prior to that, I've worked in various other parts of the world with other NGOs. So maybe I can share my screen and I'll just walk you through what I've been doing over the last 3 years with Arup I'm not going to do loads of screens because I know we've got a few issues with connectivity. But essentially, here's the first one. So essentially, what we're looking at. So hopefully, you know Arup, the engineering company. They're a global engineering company. You know, in the introductions, I always say they built Sydney Opera House. So basically, that's kind of one of their key sort of things. But they're also heavily involved in water engineering and also energy engineering, as well as sort of the built environments. So we, about 3 or 4 years ago, got a strategic partnership with Arup, and through that, we were able to apply to their global challenges pot of money and won a couple of £100,000 for a 3-year project, looking at how IWRM could be implemented in India. And through that project, getting you know, several thousand or tens of thousands of pounds of their expertise. So it wasn't just a classically funded NGO project where people are looking to implement wash systems and in remote areas. This was much more about engaging expertise of engineers to be able to analyze what was happening at district levels with NGOs and governments, and then provide some kind of assessment and advice based on that. So basically, there were 2 other very important parts of this project, and they were on the screen now, which is the People's Science Institute and Samath. Those 2 organizations are leading NGOs in India. Samath basically is an NGO that works in Gujarat, but we're working with them in Chhattisgarh. Chhattisgarh is a high tribal population state in the middle of India, where we've been basically working with local government at a district level to leverage money from the government. Just to be clear, none of the money for this project was used to pay for infrastructure. All of the money was used to basically look at how we can improve water security planning and then improve the capacity of government to fund wash infrastructure through water security plans. What we were then doing is adding the IWRM element to those water security plans because it wasn't there beforehand. So with Samath, over the last few years, we've leveraged over £1 million from the government of Chhattisgarh to provide wash infrastructure specifically to tribal populations in Chhattisgarh. The People's Science Institute are based up in Dehradun in North India. They're the Indian state government's leading IWRM practitioner for the Himachal Pradesh area. We've been working with them down in Madhya Pradesh in central India, where we've been working specifically on fluoride and arsenic mitigation. And we're working with them on how IWRM can be used as a technique, not only to improve water quantity as it normally is, but also water quality as it relates specifically to fluoride in Madhya Pradesh. So very interesting piece of work there with the People's Science Institute. So as you can see, basically it was a project with four organizations involved. Arup providing kind of global expertise on IWRM, PSI and Samath providing on-the-ground facilitation of work with communities and governments, and Frank Walter leveraging and providing the sort of network amongst this whole project, and myself project managing the whole thing. Let me try and go to the next screen. Okay, so that's just a quick summary of what we've been doing. We've been designing and implementing groundwater recharge structures, and we've been basically taking that learning, which is what was quite interesting for me about this research, was basically the idea of it not just being pure research, but it actually coming out with usable tools at the end of it, and being initially the classic toolkits, you know, the classic 70 or 100-page document, which often sits in, you can probably see a lot of them behind Dave Gordon right now, actually, and that was our slight concern, was, is it going to be a document which sits behind a professor and is never used? And then it was turned, in this case, into a mobile application, which is where it's become very interesting. And that's something I'd like to talk maybe at this meeting about. Here's a quick idea of what was happening here. As you can see, it's November 2020 right now. So this is 3 years in the making. There's a literature review, which I'm more than happy to share with you guys, which looks at IWRM or water management as it relates to South Asia and specifically India, and what the gaps have been there. And then implementing work in Madhya Pradesh and in Chhattisgarh. We had then a very interesting workshop last November, so amazingly a year ago now, where we presented the toolkit. And that was attended by the likes of UNICEF, WaterAid, IOC Wash, obviously the state government of India, and we had a lot of interest there in taking up what this toolkit can do, and I'll come to that in a moment. And now what we've got there is the completion of the toolkit, and now what we're looking for is the next stage of this, which is rolling it out across other parts of India. In case I forget to say, we are now a sort of an agreed supportive partner of the government of India, which means that we've been invited to essentially go to each state in India and talk to those state governments about how IWRM can be included into water security planning at a district level, and at how the toolkit and app that we've developed can be used in that process to build the capacity not only of governments, you know, PHED departments, but also how they can integrate with NGOs. Here's basically what we did. We came up with Arup, and again, I don't want to take too long in it, but basically what happened is we worked with the extension workers of the NGOs to break down what exactly it was that was happening in terms of water management, and that was broken down into a 6-stage process. And then classically another stage was found. By that stage we'd already called it 6 stages, so the 7th stage was called stage 0, so we could still call it a 6-stage process. But essentially what you have here is a process of the reconnaissance visits, the interim report, field visits, hydrological analysis, the water balance, which is, you know, it's the essential. I'm assuming a lot of you guys don't need to have much detail put into this, but you know, the essence here of water balances, and then the water security plan being developed, and then feedback loops being developed into that. The whole toolkit is available to you guys to download, but essentially what happens is, as you can see on the left-hand side of my screen, you would have then an understanding of each one of those stages, with then tools and workflows which are available. So in summary, if you were doing an interim report and you went to a community, you would have all of the tools available to understand, for example, what might be an initial hydrological assessment there, what might be an initial population assessment there, and you can get, and what an interim report might look like. And then once that has been developed, you got then right the way through field visits and hydrological analysis. We're not saying that you wouldn't need a hydrologist to be involved in this process, particularly at the beginning. It's not attempting to do that. But what it is attempting to do is to give local NGO and local government workers in remote areas a much better understanding of how they can build a sustainable understanding of water management in their area. And then you can see then that, again, just following on what I was saying, is this was then turned into an app. So we then got funding to turn this into an app. And here's my last screen here. So you can see that this is also downloadable. And this is where we had a lot of interest from the likes of ILC, UNICEF, and WaterAid. And we've got a meeting with Oxfam tomorrow about this, Oxfam India tomorrow. Essentially, what they're looking to do here is to give staff a much better understanding of how they can roll this out, and this be done on their phone. I'm sure, and I'd be interested to talk to you guys as researchers about this. I've been working in this area for a while. You know, the uptake of Google ODK, the Open Data Kit by Google, seems to have revolutionized the way that data is being collected in the NGOs that I'm working with in South Asia. Everybody's using Google ODK now. They're overloading it with, or overlaying it with either M-Water if you're working for WaterAid, or Kobo if you're working for other organizations. And essentially, then it lets you upload. If you look at the 1, 2, 3, if you look at the 4th one here, there's Kobo Collect. Essentially, all of the data you need to collect is now being collected on Kobo, and that can be analyzed, and that's incredibly improved. So I'll finish up there by saying that essentially that's the research we've been doing. It's kind of action-based research, understanding what's going on in terms of water management in remote areas, turning that into practical toolkits for people to use moving forward, turning that into apps. But what I'm interested to talk to you guys at the GW4 about is how research can then be applied on top of this kind of thing with NGOs like Frank Water or WaterAid and others. What we need is for better understandings of IWRM. Essentially, you know, we could come on to what that might mean, but Dave, I think, is going to ask us a few questions on that. But we need better understandings of IWRM and water management, and we need researchers to help us with that. And I would also suggest we need a better understanding of how apps and this recent development in technology is actually affecting development outcomes, and some kind of, you know, independent research as it relates to that. So, Dave, if that's okay with you, that's a kind of a wrap up of what I've been doing over the last few years. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for giving us such a wide-ranging talk in such a brief space of time. He must be exhausted from all that work. There's before we move on to the next speaker, there's a question in the chat from Jasper Coe, who said, could you have a copy of the literature review of IWRM for SEA? So if it's available and you can place a link into the chat while the next speaker's talking, that would be very helpful.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Okay. Our next speaker is Dr. Adriana Suarez Delucci, who is joining us all the way from Chile, where it's still early in the morning. She is based in the School for Veterinary Sciences at the University of Bristol, where she works on our postdoctoral program at the moment, doing research in the Colombian Amazon with the campanserios, small-scale farmers. She has recently completed a PhD at the School for Geography, where she used a sociological approach to explore the institutions of managing water in rural Chile. She is interested in activist, interdisciplinary and collaborative research to promote sustainable and just decision-making for communities and their environments. Her work is informed by institutional ethnography, a feminist sociology that investigates how everyday experiences are coordinated by work done through texts in large organizations. Today, she's going to discuss the findings from her PhD, and then I'll be open to some questions. Please go ahead, Andrea.
Thank you, David. So yeah, this is part of a result from my PhD work in rural Chile, and I used a sociological approach to look at water resource management. So in Chile, this is the official story. We have a legislation that is called the Water Code that was drafted in 1973 during a dictatorship, a right-wing dictatorship, where water was commodified and turned into any other commodity that could be sold, bought, and even auctioned in the market. And this prompted the development of different businesses, and especially water sanitary companies, private sanitary companies that worked in the provision of water and sanitation in mostly urban areas. In Latin America and in many developing countries, rural areas have generally been poor or poorer than urban areas. And so they weren't attractive for sanitary companies. So the way that water was basically distributed in rural settings was quite different to the private arrangements. So for example, since 1964 and aided by the Inter-American Development Bank, the state of Chile worked together with the communities to provide water to rural communities through a program called Rural Drinking Water, or APR in Chile. So there are more than 1,800 committees that provide water to more than 2 million people. They do not work for profit making, but it's based in a mutual aid philosophy. And I wanted to see how could this model live together or coexist together with the water code that I mentioned to you earlier. So they seem to be in contradiction. And so I also learned through the media and the TV that it was there was going on a participatory negotiation process where these communities in rural areas had come together under a national federation and were working on the production of a legislation for the rural areas and to protect their community model. Because they wanted to keep on working in the logic of mutual aid. And also they were a bit worried about some approaches by sanitary companies trying to buy the biggest of these committees. So they wanted to not only come up with this new law, but also to change and modify the water code that I mentioned to you earlier. So I wanted to study this. And in order to do that, my methodology told me I needed to go and see what was happening on the ground. So I went to a committee. I explored what was going on there, how the committee worked. I learned a lot from the people working there. There were partners in the committee that would pay a membership fee to keep the system running, but there were non-partners as well. And these people were trying to get access to becoming members of the committee and getting access to water. So I basically studied and the process that these people had to go through, and it was a very bureaucratic. I'm not going to go into any details, so don't worry, but it was a very paperwork heavy and bureaucratic. I think someone has their microphone on. So basically this process was heavily textually mediated, and I went through all the stages trying to understand what happened from the standpoint of the people that were requesting access to water. So I saw that these people had to pay for a lot of money, basically in translating these figures, £14,000 for a preliminary study, an engineering study that would set the basis for an extension work for this committee, because the committee could only provide water to a certain amount of people, but these new people were coming from urban areas. They were retired and they wanted to live in the countryside, but they weren't considered as vulnerable by the social home records, which is an instrument measuring vulnerability or poverty in Chile, which is basically a new method that has been backed up by the World Bank, by Oxford University, and it's being regarded as a very a great tool for assessing whether people are vulnerable or not. However, the way that it's assessed doesn't sit comfortably with the realities of people or their own experiences. And sometimes they are left outside government aid. And in this case, that government aid is the infrastructure for them to receive water into their houses. We're not talking about water tariff. I mean, the payment of the water tariff is not under question here. People would definitely pay for the water tariff. The problem is they would also be asked to pay for the infrastructure work. Something I forgot to mention at the beginning of the presentation is that the water code has been praised in Chile and internationally for being an efficient way of managing water. However, I saw that there were important problems with water access due to the water code as well. So these two texts, the social home records and the water code, were actually preventing access to water from people in rural areas. So basically the water code privatizes water. So there are people who have water rights that can sell them to others. So for example, these committees in rural areas, only 48% of these more than 1,800 committees have access to water rights or water resources of their own. So many times they have to buy them from those who have them, who happen to be the private sanitary companies operating in that region. So basically there's a big market of water. Some people have been able to make a lot of money from this because there's a lot of speculation. And this is a system that now is under revision, and it's been sitting in Parliament for ages trying to bring about modifications, but it's a very complicated, very political, of course, issue. And this is basically a water management issue that has more than to do more than only with technological solutions. It has to do with governance and political wills, basically, to change this. So basically, this is my study. I looked at different texts, and as you can see, this is highly bureaucratic, and it's not only about water and about water availability in the catchment, or like the principles that we could easily think when we think about water, like is there water in the catchment area or not, and the integrated water resource management within a physical basin. But this has to do a lot with basically social economic surveys, with treasury, with regional governments. It's highly political and bureaucratic. So basically my findings were that this community model, which is at the center of this sort of universe, instead of resisting water commodification, is basically reinforcing it, because this committee had to pay for water rights to the sanitary company. They weren't really acting outside the neoliberal water resources management that exists in the country, but pretty much in the center of this model for managing water, although they were doing a lot of work in trying to resist, but at the same time, they didn't have a lot of many choices. So this is my work in a nutshell. So some questions to prompt discussion might be, is there room within this framework to explore what water rights might mean? I don't know what the situation is in other countries with water rights, but here in Chile, it's quite restrictive. And this is, I mean, the problem with water management in the country does not escape the legal understanding of water rights and its commodification. So how can we understand water management in a fair, equitable, and sustainable basis is if, as the Dublin Principle 4 mentions, water has an economic value in all its competing uses and should be recognized as an economic good. So my question is, can we expand this to include other values that, you know, the IWRM framework might not be incorporating? Thank you. David, I think you're muted.
So, thank you very much for that fascinating talk and explaining the intricacies of the Chilean system so clearly, which is obviously very complicated. Before I move on to the next speaker, many of the people participating in this webinar will know that there has recently been a very important election in America. And I'm of course referring to the overwhelming vote in the referendum in Chile to amend the constitution under the dictatorship. So could you briefly just say if you think this review of the constitution will actually affect the water code?
Definitely. I mean, water in Chile is not only protected as a private commodity in the water code, but surprisingly, it's protected in the constitution, because it's such an economic, let's say, basis for any extractive activity, economic activity. So basically, the constitution has an article specifically protecting the private property of water rights, which is something that the people have spoken they want to change. I don't know how that's going to happen, but at least we're having a conversation about this. And just to say something in regards to the constitution, this is not only the only thing that we have privatized in Chile. We have private healthcare system, private education, private pensions. I mean, this is all over the place. I mean, it's a transversal problem that we have. So yeah, I hope that can be achieved somehow.
Oh, well, good luck with the review of the Constitution. Okay, I'll move on to our next speaker, Dr. Shavash Ostovar. He has not joined us from Chile, but he has rushed to join this meeting from his dentist. So hopefully this talk won't cause him too much pain. His PhD thesis was in environmental law, and it was about bringing the Ramsar Convention home, a critical examination of the legal regulations of the ecosystem of Lake Umia, in which he evaluated the International Environmental Convention, the Ramsar Convention, and Iran's national environmental regulations, ecosystem services, and internationally important wetlands. The Lake Umia Ecosystem Service in direct and indirect drivers changing the ecosystem of wetlands. His presentation in the 20th International Research Conference on Environmental Law Studies in 2018 was awarded the best presentation. His paper, A Critical Examination of Iranian National Legal Regulations of the Ecosystem of Lake Umia, was published in the International Journal of Law and Political Sciences in 2019. He is also interested in EU and international trade law and is an immigration law regulated by the Office of Immigration Service Commissions in the UK. Please, thanks.
Thank you, David. Thank you for the very nice and brief introduction. Nice to meet you, everyone, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here and have a short chat with all of you. I can see people from different, backgrounds, engineering and water resource management are here. My subject, of course, is law, so I can talk about the wetlands and water management from the law perspective. My thesis was to investigate the effectiveness of the legal regulation of the ecosystem of the Lake Ermia. Lake Ermia is one of the, I think, between the biggest 6 salty lakes in the world, and well, not far from it, Caspian Sea, which is not a sea, is another lake located in Iran, which is the biggest one. Unfortunately, because of some reasons, the lake is disappearing. The lake is located in the north of the country, which is a fairly near to Russian border and Turkey. So not much of rainfall decrease has happened on that area. So it's mostly because of the wrong rules and regulations, because when we talk about wetlands, we need to consider not only the water management and water engineering, we need to have proper rules and regulations for those. For example, when we talk about wetlands or rivers, because everything which is wet count as wetland. This is a definition mentioned in the second article of the Ramsar Convention. So when we are talking about wetlands, we need to have some sort of legal rights for them. Why? Because when we are extracting water from lakes or rivers or any wetland, we consider the share for the industry, the share for the human being in domestic use and other or agriculture industry. But the problem is not every country, or even not the Ramsar Convention, which is one of the oldest conventions in this regard, in regard of the wetlands, which was signed in 1971, and more than 90% of the UN countries they joined the convention. So when we are talking about this, well, the problem is we consider share of water for everyone, but not for the environment itself. One of the issues I tried to point out in my thesis is comparing Iranian legal system with other countries such as Australia, India, China, and even US, and see, is there a comprehensive sort of backup for wetlands, for the rivers and lakes around the world? Are they having any right of water for themselves? And surprisingly, not many countries recognize the water share right for the environment itself. In my thesis, I used socio-legal research methodology and tried to analyze both national laws and international laws in relation to the wetlands in general, and Urmia Lake, which is, as I said, one of the biggest lakes in the world, or it used to be, because a big percentage of the lake unfortunately has dried up. There's some left, but yeah, I'm trying to just warn the system that having the one of the oldest and one of the most important conventions with lots of rules and guidances, and this regarding this lake, nothing has been done, because if we could save it, we should have. And what, seeing the area which is already dried and become to the salt land is just very disappointing. While we have international rules, while we have national rules for it, so I tried to analyze, I tried to point out the problems, and try to find out what we can do to save it, what sort of rules we need to find out, what are the weaknesses of the Ramsar Convention in general, and what the convention can do to stop these sort of disasters or crises happening. Because not only in case of Iran, in US, as I said, in China's Great Salt Lake, or in Turkey, or lots of wetlands have been dried to convert to other things, like to produce food, to make factories. But from legal point of view, if we could have a proper solid backup for these wealthy lands, very pure lands, then it shouldn't have happened, these sort of disastrous crisis. So I did analyze not only Iranian law, also international laws, and some rules and regulations regarding to wetlands in England and Australia. And then I tried to compare and find out the differences and the weak points, which I got to the point saying that at the end of the day, because the main purpose of every government nowadays is the economical point. So they give the advantage to the economical part of the issue. So as long as we can produce enough food and money, and then the priority for the environment comes after human being and money and economical subjects. So I try to somehow explain we need to consider the environment while we need to consider the human being as well. So well, I'm not sure how effective it can be, but my duty as a researcher was to raise the voice and saying that we need to stop some of the things we are doing, like extracting water without doing environmental impact assessment, which is being mentioned in most of the nowadays, most of the UN conventions. And for example, for example, in Convention on Biological Diversity, and or even Chapter 17 of the Agenda 21 of the UN. So I try to bring attentions to make sure in the future these type of movement, these types of constructions or anything like that, which is going to help human being economy and well-being, must consider environmental impact assessment and also consider the rules and regulations mentioned in the Ramsar Convention to make sure our wetlands and our water is safe and gonna not only be good enough for us, also the next generation can safely in a sustainable way use the resources, the water resources. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that fascinating talk. Before I go on to more general questions, Iran, like the UK or other European countries, has democratic elections and a professional and very efficient civil service and legal system, but it also has a parallel kind of religious system which sometimes can overrule or modify what the ministries actually and the regulations actually do. Does this affect the regulation in this area, or is it entirely in the control of the government?
Well, it is not. Well, if you're talking about Iran, in Iran, when it comes to the environment, is the parliament which is making the rules for them, not the Sharia. What you say, the religion part of the laws and rules are mostly dealing with the criminal and civil part of the rules and regulations. So when we talk about the environment, I think even the Iranian government try to save the environment as much as possible, because they know when they damage the environment, they will see the consequences. How they see, as I've mentioned in my thesis, migration, people are going to lose their jobs because people around that lake are farmers, factories producing food, packing foods, and lots of this sort of industries. So when people are not happy, they are not gonna just it's some sort of disastrous crisis might happen. People might migrate, lose their jobs, and when they are not happy, they might go to the roads and start getting against the government. So they don't want this. So they try to as much as they can, I believe, to sort out the problems. But as I mentioned, and you very sharply mentioned that those part of rules, I mean, religious part is completely differ from the environmental rules. So we cannot really connect these two together.
Thank you for that clarification.
Right, no problem.
Okay. One thing that is very noticeable from all three speakers is you all dealt with the main issue of water rights from different perspectives. I just wanted to ask, before we open it to more general questions and more general discussion, what do you think the main issues in water rights are? What needs to be done in terms of the regulation and the agreements we have, such as the Dublin Statement on Water and Sustainable Development and the various human rights conventions, to actually practically implement water rights? What needs to be done that we haven't done so far with regard to water rights? So it's open to all three speakers.
I'll quickly give my opinion on that. I think there has to be some sort of bottom line, I guess. Priorities of uses is something that has been discussed here in Chile, that there should be, we don't have it in place at the moment. So basically, the human right to water is not considered in the water code, and it's not in the constitution. And then to make that applicable, there would need to be some sort of, I guess, priorities of uses. So for example, first human consumption, then agriculture or livelihoods, and then mining, forestry, fisheries, etc., like industrial uses. That's one of the solutions, I guess. Yeah.
Jon?
I mean, I think I would defer to Adriana and Suarez on the legal framework of it. From a personal point of view, what I see is a need to have this planned out much better. I mean, I work directly with district collectors in areas where you just see the IWRM, and the idea of water management is just a secondary idea to the idea of grand water schemes, you know, unplanned, you know, large scale projects that are technically unsound, to be honest, but look good. And to also agree with Adriana, you know, a lack of focus on the idea of populations being a priority user of water as against industry or agriculture. You know, that seems to be on the ground when you're talking to district collectors, that is lacking there. And that may be, and to come maybe to the more legal framework, maybe that's lacking from them at a district level, because at the state level that's not there, and that's because you know, and we can go up and up and up. You know, and just as a last one from me, I mean, that maybe is because partly this level SDG 6.5. Maybe even just saying that gives it more sort of a potential authority than really it actually has. You know, that when you get down to it, there's no there. And one thing I'd like to move on, how all this is evaluated anyway. You know, so India, as one of the largest users of water with a huge population, has not reported at all on SDG 6.5. It's all voluntary. Nobody's really clear how well people are doing, if that's the right word. And that's where I'd really be interested in talking to you guys at the GW4 about this kind of idea of what does the integrated in IWRM really mean? You know, and how do you measure that, and how do you you know, how do you make improvements on that? So this is a couple of quick points from me, maybe not so much on the legal front, but on the practical front.
Suresh? Do you want to add anything, Suresh?
Well, thank you for you know, giving me another chance. Well, I think one of the main things I ended up with, you know, that issue of the legal part of the problem nowadays is rules and regulations are not being reviewed on a regular base. So we have some rules going back to like 70 years ago, 60 years ago, which are like not really effective because they are belong to that time. Also, another point is, well, when you refer to the Ramsar Convention, they don't hold the contracting parties liable for what they have done. So if you, for example, report your wetland to the convention, that's brilliant. But if you don't,
Doesn't matter.
no one blame you. On the other hand, there is an approach for the wetlands in danger, and there is a list for that which is called Montrex list. But again, there is no some sort of legal enforcement to make sure if there is a wetland and the ecological character or any part of the lake, or I mean flora fauna is changing. Under the Ramsar Convention, you need to report it to the Montrex record. But again, there is no enforcement for that. So if anything happened and the government under the sovereign right decide not to report that wetland to the Montrex report to get more help financially and scientifically, there is no one to say why you didn't do that, and no one to blame. So that's one of the other issues apart from the first one.
Thanks very much. So Jasper Coe's asked a question, and if any of you want to ask questions, please type them in the chat or raise your hand if you want to say them. He's asked about outdated laws that are outdated and the challenges of amending and updating certain environmental laws. Why do governments take no effort in this? And also, all the speakers have been saying that although there are laws like and agreements like the Convention and SDG 6.5 on integrated water resources management, these things seem to be mainly aspirational rather than, you know, rock solid legal instruments. They also seem to be rather under researched. So I would like your views, not just on what Jasper Coe's question about why governments don't do it, but also what research areas relating to integrated water resources management have not been explored. What are the gaps? So not just what governments need, why governments haven't done it, but what do we need to do as a research community to actually push this agenda?
Very briefly, I just think that what we're encountering, and not only with water, but with the idea of managing water resources, managing nature, I think we're encountering a crisis of a paradigm in our relationship to nature, to be honest, and in the environment, and perhaps we need to rethink the frameworks that we are using in our way to approach not only nature, but people and our, the emphasis we have in progress development. What does that actually mean? To what extent are we pushing those agendas? And when or where is the limit to that? So perhaps as academics, we need to do more work on sort of expanding possibilities to other realities, and instead of being, dreamy or in a way unrealistic, trying to see other alternatives as real, because we need to start thinking about other ways of development, I think.
Shall I come in after that? Yeah, I mean, I think Adriana's comments are great. I mean, we had a coffee, and I was really captured by the whole idea of what she's talking about in her research. I couldn't agree with it more, really. I mean, we were, from my point of view, IWRM has got a lot of gaps. I was at a meeting of IRC, the IRC WASH. I don't know, and if you don't know those guys, I'd recommend looking up IRC WASH. They're a Dutch-based NGO who was set up by the WHO about 50 years ago. They specialize in systems thinking as it relates to the water sector and WASH sector. And at that meeting, there was a guy, a guy who works for USAID, saying to me, there's so little research showing that IWRM actually improves water and sanitation outcomes. And the reason he was looking for that research was that the USAID program managers were saying, we're not going to fund water resource management projects anymore because we've got no evidence that they actually improve water and sanitation outcomes for vulnerable populations. And unless you can come up with an evidence base of that, then we're not going to fund it under our aid program, which is helping people to receive to better SDG 6. So certainly, that sounds so basic. And I'm wondering whether anyone in the GW4 has actually looked at that area. What is the link between IWRM and water and sanitation outcomes? It's one area I would personally be interested in. As I've mentioned before, I think there's a massive area in terms of how do you evaluate any of this? At the end of this project I was doing with Arup, we were just looking at CAP surveys, knowledge, attitude, and practice surveys, where a little bit relating back to Adriana, going like, maybe we just need a different way of looking at this. Maybe we just need a different way of thinking about this whole area and how we measure it and how we analyze it, what the framework for it is. So one way, and the reason we were looking at a CAP survey, which is basically to go to government extension workers and go to NGO workers and talk to them about their knowledge, attitude, and practice as it relates to water management, is that there was no other way of measuring it realistically at a district level. We couldn't measure improved integration in water management because it was almost impossible to define what that meant. But obviously, I'm a project manager in civil society. If I had 3 or 4 years to do a PhD on it, then maybe that might be something that somebody could come up with something that could help me out, which would be great if somebody could do that. Thank you. And the last thing for me, while I've got the floor, as it were, I would also encourage people to look at 3IE, 3IE is an impact-based organization as it relates to water and sanitation, and they rather shockingly say, basically, there's 4 areas that still need work. One of them, unbelievably, is gender. Gender as it relates to water and sanitation is an under-researched area, which is incredible to me. Another is on vulnerable populations. I'm working at the moment with almost exclusively what's called scheduled tribe, or particularly vulnerable tribal communities, or scheduled caste as it relates to the India context. There's hardly any research on that. On how water management, and you could relate it to Suarez and Adriana's work about the legal rights of vulnerable populations in South Asia. For example, there's the Forest Rights Act in India of 2006 that's been absolutely rolled over by many states. Is there any research on that? I don't think so. And then the last thing for me, there's very little research on behavior change. I work on water and sanitation and hygiene, and I have to be honest, hand washing and behavior change in South Asia is an absolute nightmare. And we're still looking back to Robert Chambers, who obviously is a legend, but Robert Chambers did community-led total sanitation like 20 years ago, and people are still using that because there's a lack of research on how you actually change people's behavior unless you literally use soap operas to do it. And the last thing is, increasingly, I'm doing work on what you could call institutional wash, which is basically moving out of the household and looking in schools and health centres. And there's almost no research apparently on water and sanitation as it relates to health centres. So there's huge amounts of opportunity here for the GW4. There's 4 or 5 or 6 areas that I think you can help. The first 2 directly would help me in project management, and the others would be filling gaps which are known to be global gaps in research here. So there's just a couple of things that I think Adriana wants to come back into.
Before Andrea comes back, or Suarez wants to add something, you raise a really important point about these large under-researched areas that I3 and we've identified in this discussion. It may be something that the GW4 Water Security Alliance wants to take up by setting up a subgroup or a task force on integrated water resource management. So if anyone who's joining this webinar would be interested in being part of that kind of grouping, it would be very helpful if you could either send an email or post it in the chat. Suarez, do you want to say something?
Yeah, thank you. I'm just following up with Jon's idea about lots of gray areas in the research. I do agree with that. In my thesis, I got to the point realizing that a really simple point like sharing information regarding one wetland in this country with the other one is not being done properly. So there are lots of gray areas and lack of proper and regular information sharing between the contracting parties. And also another point was which, well, to me is important, is a designation of competence body for wetland management. In most of the countries, when you go and deeply do a research regarding the competent bodies dealing with the water management, you realize that they may not be the competent body. So what I believe is it needs to be some sort of monitoring by the convention or the third party in this regarding this subject. I mean, passing the information, handling the information between all contracting parties, and also make sure that the competence body is dealing with the wetlands and not politicians. Sorry, clearly. Thank you.
Okay, there's going to be a poll sent out which will appear asking if you'd be interested in joining the subgroup. So please answer that. I'm afraid that time has flown, and this conversation would probably go on for a long time. I'm going to have to sum up and end soon. But before that, Adriana, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, just very quickly to say that I would go back to like the power of these international texts and these courses, like for example, the Dublin Principles, maybe revisiting them is not a crazy idea, because gender is there as well, and it's an interesting phrasing about women being responsible, or I can't remember the exact wording, but it's a very complex way of phrasing it, and I think, yeah, perhaps we need to revisit not only the fourth or second principle, maybe all of them. They've been there since 1992, so probably, you know, it wouldn't damage us to have a little look at them.
Okay, we've had a fascinating series of talks from three very different perspectives, which have highlighted from, again, their different perspectives of NGOs, from geography and feminist perspective, from a socio-legal perspective, a similar set of problems. And I think this is an area which is quite dynamic and important and in need of additional research. So I would like to, or just the polls come through, 92% review polled of so in favour of setting up a team which can be explored after this conference to set up some more research in this area. So thank you very much for answering that poll. And I think that's a good way to end this session. Please can we thank the speakers. I think you can do it with your reactions in but also online. It's been an excellent set of talks, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon now. Fantastic session.
Thank you.
And good luck with the
Thank
rest.
you, David.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Thank you,
everyone.
David, for chairing, and for all the speakers as well. Really appreciate it. And I did put it in the chat. As a result of the poll, the Water Security Alliance team will go away. We'll speak to John and to others and try and form a group that can start to look at this special interest water research area. Okay.
My pleasure.
Thank you, everybody.
That's a fantastic outcome.
And can I just say thank you to Adriana and to Suarez. Thank you so much, guys, for contributing. It's awesome. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you both.
It was a pleasure. Thank you. Have a lovely day.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.